All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Prevention Perk. We're going to talk about cultural competence today, and I am just thrilled to have our guest here with us. It's one of my favorite topics, and Ricky Barton can attest to this. We've been doing the substance abuse prevention skills training for about 7 years now, and one of the components in there has always been cultural competency, and it's always been my favorite to draw out of that training. And I was so excited when they went from like 2 small little paragraphs to like 6 pages in the training. Could still use a little bit more meat and potatoes, if you will, but it's still something that I think we don't consider as much as we should, and that's cultural competency, or you can call that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or you can call that justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. You can call it a lot of things. It's about how do you get people to the table, especially those that you may not otherwise associate with. It's about really bringing community together. And Tyree Davis is an employee here at Community Partnership. He's the Community Diversity and Equity Director. And he brings an interesting perspective to this topic. And I've asked him to kind of talk about his expertise. And then we want to kind of talk through how we can connect this to our prevention initiatives, and that includes mental health service as well. So I don't want to delay too long. I want to go ahead and open up the floor and give Tyree a moment to introduce himself and talk us through this. And as always, if the audience has questions, this is a coffee shop conversation. Please feel free to unmute yourselves or raise your hand and we'll call you out, whatever you want to do, but let's make it as engaging as possible. So good morning, Tyree.
Good morning, Steve. Good morning, everyone else. So many familiar faces. I was a little nervous, but not anymore. As Steve mentioned, I prefer interactive because as much as I love me, I get tired of talking sometimes and hear my own voice. So if we can make this as interactive as possible, I would truly enjoy that. So as Steve mentioned, I am housed as CPO. I work for the community and I'm the Community Diversity and Equity Director. So I will partner with other nonprofits or small business, big business, faith-based institutions. If you can think of it, I will work with them to help implement equity, diversity, and inclusion for them in their organization and whatever that looks like for them, because diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a one-size-fits-all approach, as we all know. And what is good for the goose is not always good for the gander. So I am happy to answer questions or and have a conversation. I was doing research when I was looking at this, or when Steve first asked me about this, and there's not a lot of information. There's a lot of information talking about the need for inclusion in prevention services, but just not a lot that has been done around it study-wise. So I think that there are boots on the ground people. Steve mentioned that they've went from a few paragraphs to pages of information around prevention now, but it is important. And I think when we talk about prevention and mental health, it is something that has come to the forefront over the last few years, fortunately, for around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, I know over the last year, myself personally, with everything that was going on between the civil unrest in America, the coronavirus, that took a toll on my mental health and a lot of people that look like me, mental health as well. So to then compile all of that on everyday life was a lot. And when we look at preventing folks from using drugs, that is a surefire pathway for people to feel like they can alleviate one pain and pick up on something else, unfortunately. You're muted, Steve.
I think I mentioned this to you when we were talking about this. I was in a discussion with some community leaders in one of the neighboring counties that I work in, and I made the comment about, you know, this with the Partnership for Success grant. It's about subpopulations is the term that's been written into the grant, but it's implying the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I brought that up in conversation, and the response I got is the size of the minority population in our community is really pretty insignificant. I don't even know that that's something that we should be concerned with. So my immediately response is, well, let's look at it through a different lens. Maybe it is persons of the same gender and the same race that come to the table, but do you think that the Methodists and the Baptists will get together in the same room and talk about prevention? And one guy laughed nervously and he said, I think it'd be a far stretch if they did. And I said, we can start there, because I think all too often we look at this as a black and white issue.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll go a little bit further and say male and female issue. You know, it's not always that cut and dried. It's like there are a lot of people that we don't interact with. And I go to a lot of meetings in a lot of different communities. And most of the time, it's a topic, but it's not something that anybody ever gets any traction with. I won't say anybody. Most of the time, there's no traction with it. So, I mean, as somebody who's doing this on the front lines all the time, what do you say when that's the comment? Because I came back and looked at the demographics for this particular community and found out they have over 7,000 non-English speaking residents. To me, that's pretty significant. But it says that this individual doesn't see these people or interact with those individuals. So it's insignificant. I'm not saying he did it on purpose, but it's, you know, it's out of sight, out of mind. So how do you step back with a table full of people that most of the time look just like me, maybe without the beard, and say, hey, we need to dig in here and let's start making a difference in this area?
Yeah, I think that is what you just said. You have to be the one to step up to the table and say that there are, I mean, people out there that don't look like us that we are missing out on. And I think that you mentioned it was like people look at this as a black and white issue. In the diversity, equity, and inclusion world, there's a term called intersectionality where it looks at folks for everything that they are. So my intersections that overlap, I'm Black and I'm a man in America. You know, I have a friend, she's a woman, she's queer, she's a woman of color. So there are layers of people and versus just what you see surface level. And I would also even go further to that person. Yes, you may not have folks of color, but I'm sure that everyone in your town doesn't make the same amount of money. Everyone in the town is not straight. Everyone in the town does not have the same religious beliefs as you brought up. There are ways that you can get to equity, diversity, and inclusion outside of race, because that is the first thing that you see. But I do think it is important for folks in the majority to be able to speak up and say something around equity, diversity, and inclusion, because it then removes the burden from people of color to always be the one speaking up in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which can be tiresome for some folks and not so much for others. But it does remove the burden off of the people who have been marginalized since the turn of time in this country.
Mm-hmm. Other questions from the audience?
I have a question. So kind of going with that as well. So let's say we do have a coalition that definitely does not have everyone at the table that needs to be at the table. Let's say it is a substance use prevention coalition and we actually don't have anyone that has experienced a substance use disorder or has gone through addiction and recovery, or maybe we have a violence prevention coalition that doesn't have someone at the table that has experienced domestic violence or has experienced violence in their life. And so we're missing those representatives and we're missing those voices, as well as, let's say everyone at the table is white, or there is just very much a lack of diversity. Do you have any recommendations on how we go about bringing people to the table without it seeming like, okay, we're just checking a box and making sure that there's someone there that represents that specific population, so that they don't feel like they're alone in that? Is it inviting multiple people that are a part of that specific group that we're trying to bring to the table? Or I don't know, do you have any specific steps on what that can look like?
Well, I think there are strength in numbers. So I think it is a whole lot easier for folks to speak up when they feel as though they've been heard and seen in a room. But also, I think more importantly, we have to start those. It takes time to get there. I'm not just going to walk up to a random person and ask them about their business and expect for them to tell me, whatever it is that I want to know or need to know from them. So we have to start building relationships now that can eventually get to where we want to go. But I also think if you can't find someone who has been through that experience, I am sure there are, testimonials on YouTube or the internet, on the internet for folks to watch and feel, and then start to think about what can we do to help, or the people that in our community that are going through these things, since we don't have someone who can give that to us in this very moment.
That's good. Okay, thank you.
I wanted to maybe jump in on that thought, and Sam, it's a really good point. I read specifically there's one chapter in the Why All the Black Kids Sit in the Cafeteria Together in Cafeteria. And in that book, the author, of course, makes the point similar in the White Fragility, where there's that concept where we as white have just had this frame of reference our entire lives of kind of white culture, and that is our norm, and we've never really experienced in a lot of ways anything outside of that. So it can become kind of the token person in a coalition when you do bring in someone who maybe represents a different perspective, whether that's race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, all of that. We can kind of be like, okay, so tell us all about your people and tell us what you think, and we want to know all the things. And I think that can put a lot of pressure on that individual to be the representative for their specific group or sector that we're asking them to bring diversity about. So I guess my question is it better to be upfront about that and kind of say like, hey, I would love for you to join this coalition and recruit under the pretense of, I'm asking you to represent the LGBTQ population, and I would love to hear your voice about that? Or is it more, better to kind of let them just naturally fall into that role and maybe like hope or assume that they'll speak up from that perspective and kind of just make that part of it? Like, is there a right or wrong or better or worse way to approach trying to get diversity on a coalition in terms of maybe the approach and the invite to it?
Well, I certainly think of the two options. I certainly think the latter is better, because I think when you go in asking a person to represent an entire community, you're not going to get that, because my experience as a Black man in America is going to be very different from my brothers, who will be very different from my father's, who will be very different from his, well, I guess he's my dad, so our cousin. No experience, there is no monolithic experience in whatever marginalized community is being represented. So maybe it is asking them to join, and if they want to share their experience, then they can share their experience, because people don't owe you their story all the time. And that's one part of it. But then also people get tired of saying the same thing over and over and over. And that leads to mental health trauma. Also, by keep retelling the same story and reliving the same trauma that you've experienced. So it just really depends on the person, the individual. As someone who does this work for a living, I don't mind it. I have a great therapist that gets me through all of these things. But not everyone has the same access and that same privilege to be able to afford and go through those needs that I have.
So it brings up an interesting perspective that I'd like to maybe some of the other people that are on the Zoom might weigh in on, because as I look here, they are all prevention leaders in some way or another. I mean, with the exception, I don't believe I know Nancy, but I think everyone else is involved in prevention and in the community in some way. And I know that this oversimplifies it, but let's just say, well, we want to have representation It could be from the senior population, you know? And one of the things that's suggested is, well, we're asking them to come and sit at our table, but isn't that kind of a one-sided relationship? Are we engaging in their world as well? Because when I step back and think, some of us are volunteering our time as coalition leaders. Are we asking for other duties as assigned, so to speak? Well, not only are we asking you to be a part of our prevention initiative, but now we're saying if we want to invite older people, people of different sexuality, different race, whatever, now I got to go to all these other things. Is that an experience that maybe some other people in this audience have shared, and maybe you have a way, something you can weigh in about that? Because I understand that, and maybe that oversimplifies it. If I want Tyree to come to my group, maybe I need to go someplace where, you know, the shoe's on the other foot and I'm the representative in his group. But now I'm going to all these multiple things, and you see where I'm coming from. And I just wonder if that's been an experience for others, because to me it comes down to relationships. You know, how am I spending my time, and who am I spending my time with? But I'm just curious, have either others on the audience had that experience, you know, where it's like, well, I am going to this group because this group we want them to be a part of our group.
You know, if I may, Steve, two thoughts. One is the old saying about nothing about us without us, and that goes both ways. It's a giving and receiving kind of a thing. The other thing, though, is that keeping in mind that everybody, all of us, are listening to the same radio station, WII-FM. What's in it for me? And so everybody, when we come to that table, right, there's a reason that we're there, and being able to share that with other people is as much a part of, I think, understanding them and their culture and what they bring, but there's also a reason behind why they bring it. And it may be that while they're helping us with our reason and our cause, that we can help them with theirs.
Good point. Others?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that. Yeah, it's definitely about building relationships and engagement. And it's very much, you know, if you want to engage someone, you have to be involved in what they're a part of as well and what's important to them. Here where I work in Howe County, one of the good examples is it's been difficult to work with the hospital and their behavioral health sector. And because they're notoriously closed ranked. And so one of the things that I did was I reached out to their board. They have a community advisory board for their behavioral health services. And so they were very much interested in being a part of the coalition here in Howe County, with the understanding that I would also be a part of their board. So I could be aware of what they're working on, and they actually have several of their clients on that board as well, which is really interesting. So, but they are a part of the coalition and I'm on their board, and it's a great relationship because I get to understand what they're working on and where they're at, as well as the clients that they work with. They have client representatives and they also get to weigh in. And it's a really good relationship because anytime any sort of connection is needed as far as, people in the community that I want to reach out to and kind of get a feel for what they would like, they're always there and they're always open to that. And the same thing, if they ever need anything from the coalition or from CPO, they know that they can reach out to me, and we're always there with that. So it's definitely about building relationships and being involved. And sometimes it can be a little much if you have several different groups, but it's still just really important to let them know that, hey, we need you, but I'm going to be there for you as well.
Great. Good point, Amanda. Thanks. Others? Other questions?
I guess kind of maybe moving into the actual actions of a coalition, not just building capacity and membership and all of that. But, you know, when we get into prevention work, we're looking at disparities. We're looking at a disparity, whether it's based on their age, based on use rates, based on, you know, grants often ask for socioeconomic, racial, you know, all kinds of different demographics to understand the community. But beyond that, when we get into the work, we're really looking to address disparities. So what's the best way to approach that when you're in a coalition meeting and you're talking about activities, and you're talking about building a plan or writing a grant? Because I would imagine that it could become offensive, or you know, you would risk that by talking about that. Now, granted, some people may look at that and say like, hey, good, finally, we're going to approach an issue that our community has been struggling with forever. But maybe just tips on a good way to have that conversation that could be a little bit more delicate, because coming from like a white chairperson who's saying like, hey, there's all these, you know, issues we need to address in the Black community, like I could see how that could come across. So any tips on that?
Yeah, I think it's we've all heard the old saying, it's not what you say, but how you say it, which I am actively working on. So just being cognizant of the language and verbiage that you're using. Excuse me, I think what you really touched on something. I think you can always tie this back to health inequities, and how, you know, the use of substance leads to shorter lifespans, or, you know, all the disparities that exist. So, I mean, you're always coming from a good place when you're talking about those types of issues in America. And I mean, we see with the whole COVID-19 vaccine, we see and I speak to this specifically, the lack of Black people getting vaccinated. And then we look at all the historical things that have happened, you know, between the Tuskegee experiment, all of the Black women that were given hysterectomy so they could not reproduce during the 50s and the 60s. So if we can tie that all back into the inequities around healthcare and that substance abuse leads to, I think that you can always come from a good place there. But I think most important is verbiage, and trying not, and I don't think that anyone would do, but like trying to do the whole blame game thing.
That's an interesting point, because yesterday we were having a roundtable discussion with several prevention leaders from different counties, and one of the things that that kind of came up was you know, this just kind of how you address these issues, and how it's not about, at least the way I took away from it, it's not about like what happened in the past. Prevention is really about coming together and really trying to prevent something from happening in the future. So there really is no, well, you treated us this way, or you overlooked us in that way. And it's like, to me, that's really, it's kind of a hard sell, but the truth of it is we're trying to prevent something that hasn't happened yet. Mm-hmm. So whatever your history or background is great. And maybe you could bring an interesting perspective to our efforts as we're going forward. But what we're really trying to do is stop men, women, children, Black, white, yellow, brown, green, whatever, from doing this in the future, you know? And I think that sometimes we get lost in the looking back and being maybe overly sensitive, as opposed to saying the truth of the matter is people that are white are just as apt to abuse drugs and suffer life consequences going forward as Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, gay, straight, women, men. It's interesting, and how do we frame it like that? You know, I like the two terms, one talking about the verbiage and the other one, the intersectionality. Like, there's so many different layers to who I am, and how do we like just bring that uniqueness to the table and say, what we're really trying to do here is prevent kids from losing their way and becoming adults that really don't have the future that they could if they didn't engage in this substance use now. I that's what it seems like, oversimplifies it again, but how do you bring people to the table and say, sorry, what happened in the past, not to gloss over that, but we're really worried about what's going to happen tomorrow for men, women, and children around drug use, mental health issues. And how do we kind of celebrate that? I mean, that's what comes through the SAPS training and talking about cultural competency, is just really being aware of the fact that it's okay if everyone doesn't look, act, walk, talk, and worship in the same way that I do. We all want to try to make sure that it's a better place for us all to live tomorrow. And there's a finesse to that. I wished I knew the answer, because I'd write that book and I'd retire.
Yeah.
This is Louise. I was just going to chime in with that. I think when you start to put all these pieces together, when you talk about relationship building and coalition building and communication and helping to do those interventions, you're talking, it all boils down to building that trust of that relationship. And that trust historically has either been impacted negatively or positively. And so you may have to build a bridge to develop a positive trust, a positive relationship. And maybe my interaction isn't necessarily built around any of those layers that we talked about, but maybe it is that I bring it up that I want to help my neighbors or the family. I want to do what I can to help your family stay healthy and well. And that's not necessarily talking about any of those sectors. That's just, I guess, a family is a sector as well. So it depends on where you're going to build that relationship, where you're going to build that trust. What do you want to build it from? Where do you want to build it to? And I just see that a lot of trying to find something, that common ground sector, like what is our common ground, and then build from that. And we all, like all the people here today, all care about prevention, all care about families, all care about youth growing up healthy and strong. So what is that we can all work together and build from? So I think you're on the right track. I like it.
Other questions, comments? I'm sitting here through this whole discussion thinking, this would be a great discussion to have on a regular basis. I mean, we're doing a book study in our division, but just having this kind of different perspective, talking outside the box, because I think I've learned a few things, but I'm also aware of the fact that I could learn a whole lot more, and not just because it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's just about relationships. How can I be a better relator to the people that are in my life and that I would like to have included in my life? Any other thoughts you want to add, Tyree, or questions from the audience?
I would just say keep up the good work, and we got a long way to go, which is job security for us all.
Yeah. We're not going to be unemployed tomorrow, I don't think. Well, I appreciate everyone being here today. We will run it at 30 minutes, which is kind of fantastic. I do want to mention that what I have in my scope for the next prevention perk topic is having a conversation about how to talk to your kids. We have a video segment of that on our Helping Everyone Learn Prevention video series. And the individual that's featured in that video is someone that I'm approaching about being our guest host to talk more about that. When we reconvene the perk, that would be on September the 16th. So put that on your calendar once we get the guest lined up, and make sure that's the topic we're going to have. We'll send out a invite and a reminder. We'd love to have you in the audience at that time, because I think it ties in well with this. It's about relationships and communication, and how do we talk to kids about this issue of prevention and hopefully set the stage for them to be a receptive audience. So thanks everyone for being here today. Hope you have a great Thursday and hope to see you again sometime soon.